Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mindscape Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Carroll. Now, let's face it, we've all contemplated how we would go about committing the perfect murder. Or if any of you are truly innocents out there, perhaps you've contemplated what it would be like to be the victim of a perfect murder. One way or the other, perfect murders are the kinds of things that dwell in our minds. We want to know what it would be like. One of the things that we think is true, anyone who has watched TV or movies knows, it is harder these days to commit the perfect murder than it might have been in the past. The ability of the police and their friends to investigate crimes is better than it ever has been before, in large part because of science, because of our ability to do chemistry and forensic science that teaches us something from the crime scene about what actually went down. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Ray Burks is an analytical chemist who moved from actually working in a crime lab to becoming a professor at St. Edward's University in Texas, where she continues to work in forensics. Her lab constructs detectors that look for explosives, drugs, and other substances of questionable repute to help the cops catch the bad guys. We're going to talk about different types of poison, if that's the way you want to roll, how to dispose of a body. This is a big problem for would-be murderers out there. And also the major differences between what you watch on CSI and the real world of a forensic investigator. As far as I can tell, the major difference involves paperwork. So hopefully this is going to be an amusing listen. Usually in podcasts, my goal is that something educational happens, but I'm not quite sure I really want this one to be very educational. Let's stick with amusing, shall we? Hopefully this will not turn out to be useful in your own future planning. I really don't want Mindscape Podcast to be investigated by the FBI. Despite our best efforts, though, it's very possible you're going to learn something as well as have a few thought-provoking ideas go into your mind. All right, let's go. Ray Burks, welcome to the Mindscape Podcast.
Thank you.
So I'm very excited. We're going to talk about chemistry and murder.
Murder.
Which came first for you, the chemistry or the murder?
Murder.
Murder came first?
Murder.
That got you into the chemistry?
Murder got me into chemistry.
How did that happen?
So I wanted to be a lawyer, and I was a real dorky kid. I used to go to the library on Saturday carrying a briefcase that my parents got me because they supported my dorkiness. And I used to go and I used to read law books and learn about collateral estoppel. And so again, really fun.
Sexy stuff, yeah.
I know, very fun kid. And then in junior high, I got an opportunity to go to a junior high trip. And we went to Washington, D.C., which, of course, if you want to be a lawyer and you're a kid, that's like...
It's like Mecca, yeah, right.
But then we had an opportunity to visit FBI field office, and at the time they were had a tour, a little bit of forensic science, talking about crime and how science could be used for that. And I had never, ever before in my life thought science was remotely interesting or useful.
Okay.
But this really did it for me, because I was just like, what? You can use you can use science to do stuff, and I don't know why it never really hit me before. Some people, of course, my age in the shuttle era would have been big into space or dinosaurs, and that never really got me. But the forensic science, that really resonated. And then from there, I just went down the nerd rabbit hole.
Because this was high school age.
Junior high.
Junior high,
yeah.
Okay. But then that's when you actually actively became interested in chemistry for its own sake.
Yes. Because, a lot of the tests, the idea that you didn't know what something was and you could do some tests and figure out what it was, that really got me.
Right.
The solving mysteries. And I think that, it's kind of what, in a weird way, being a bit of a law nerd when I was little and watching Murder, She Wrote with my grandmother and Matlock, and there was always some lawyer running around solving, or some ex-high school teacher who wrote mystery novels just up to no good. And so seeing that science could, solve these mysteries was really the hook that got me interested. And then that's when I realized, I'm like, oh, so science is like kind of a big deal.
Yeah. And that's probably common, but you stuck with the whole murder aspect. I mean,
yes.
I don't know exactly your trajectory. I'll figure it out before I post the episode. But you worked in some kind of law enforcement capacity.
Yeah, I was in a crime lab. So, I chemistry, and then went to graduate school, and then left graduate school and worked in a crime lab for a while. And so, that's what I thought I would do for the rest of my life was, be in that line of work.
So this is literally CSI stuff. You're doing the... I don't know what you were doing. You're analyzing compounds, trying to figure out what it is.
Lots of, I worked at a small crime lab. It was just 5 people. And, you're doing a little bit of everything. Sometimes you get called out to a crime scene. But a lot of times you're just, you're pulling casework that you get assigned. You go down to evidence property, you pick up the stuff.
Yeah.
And you bring it back, and you might be doing all kinds of things. I actually did a lot of forensic video and image analysis.
Oh, okay.
In addition to chemical processing and physical processing of prints. Again, it was a very, kind of small, and so you kind of had to like cross-train and do certain things. And then we also, when we were called out to do, crime scene work, that was something that you had to be requested to go out. So that, and then it was usually some type of major incident. So it could have been a homicide. It could have been, say, a robbery, which, threat of violence or something of that nature, that you would get called out and have to do kind of all this crime scene work.
Any particularly memorable incidents from that period of your life?
Tons of memorable incidents. Very few I could talk about.
Very few you can talk about. Yeah. This is your law training.
Yes,
you know a little bit about what the rules are. Yes, that's right.
So I would say, for CSI, I think, and I knew this just from, really being involved in going through education and everything, is that, first of all, in CSI, none of us are that good looking. None of us have wardrobes that are that hip or cool. I never had sunglasses that neat. And I always used to watch those shows, especially when I was in that job, and they never show them doing paperwork. And I know I spent at least half my time documenting and writing reports.
You think the show would be improved if there was more paperwork?
I think the show would be improved CSI paperwork.
Yeah, CSI paperwork.
But I think that was the fun part is, it's like, okay, so take all of that, cut the episode by 20 minutes, and put in just writing reports.
More paperwork.
All paperwork.
Right. I have no idea why you're not a showrunner for a major...
I don't know either.
Someday soon, I hope, yes. So then what in the world gave you the idea that what you really wanted to do was be a professor?
I think it's funny because, I planned this whole thing where I was going to work in the crime lab for a long time. And definitely when I was in graduate school, you kind of sometimes are surrounded by folks that want to be an academic. And a little bit different in chemistry, because chemistry is also very... in industry.
It's useful for things other than being a professor.
Oh, sure. I mean,
not like theoretical physics.
Well, that was not me.
No, that was me.
But I think, chemistry with its history and applications, there's the kind of common thing is that a third are in academia, a third are kind of in government labs, a third's in industry. So, lots of applications in that way. And so actually most of the people that I went to graduate school with were not going to be academics. It's just chemistry.
Right.
I mean, it's a little bit different for other fields.
So this was your PhD program. You had a PhD before the crime lab. Yeah.
And so a lot of people, actually, no, I left. This is what not to do, kids. I left graduate school to take this super awesome job because there's not that many jobs. And I said, you know what? I will totally write my dissertation while I'm working a new full-time job.
Famous last mistake. Yeah.
So funny. I mean, I did, but let's just say it took a little bit longer than I had deluded myself and my advisor into thinking. But yeah, so I think I think most of the people in definitely in my PhD program or in the lab that I was in, a lot went into working at, say, GlaxoSmithKline or Merck or, there's a colleague that works at NIST. So a big mix. Academia is not the big deal. And so that was not uncommon, and you planned for that. Like in your programs, a lot of people are going into industry and chemistry. And so, or they're going to be full-time researchers, but not professors, and not academics. And so that was really interesting to me, because that certainly wasn't what I went to graduate school for. But I had, I learned a lot, and I definitely, when you start doing a job, then I realized, hey, I kind of actually miss doing the research and development, because when you're active casework, you just have no time.
Certainly not doing research, no.
No, I mean, and
a lot of paperwork to get done.
There's a lot of paperwork to be getting done, but your case backlog in some places can be, several months, if not years. And so even though you might be best positioned to develop some new method, you have no time or no resources in order to do that. So I missed that. And I did miss teaching, even though, when you go to graduate school, as you don't really get a PhD in teaching or education.
No.
So
the more successful you are, the less you teach.
Right. So it was kind of funny to me. And then, going back into academia, I realized that, wow, I did miss these things. And it kind of, in a way, snuck up on me, because it's not quite what I planned for. But I like the training aspect, too, of undergraduate research, because I'm at a principally undergraduate institution. So, the idea of training folks to do field work or lab work, and, really giving them the opportunity to develop new skills is in an informative way is really fun. I find that it's very hard. Some days you're like, I hope I am not messing this up.
Yep. A lot of responsibility.
But it's also a lot of fun to see, people really grow into their scholarship and into their profession.
So I do physics for a living. Some people have the misimpression that this is somehow close to chemistry. In fact, I know nothing about chemistry. I've never even taken a chemistry class at the university level. I took high school chemistry. So if you had in mind that what you were interested in was sort of the forensic side of chemistry, what kind of chemist would you become? I know there's physical and organic and inorganic and so forth.
I would say analytical.
So what does that mean?
So I like to call analytical chemists the detectives of chemistry. So we tend not to make chemicals, we find them.
Okay.
And we tend to find them in a sea of other ones. So, I always joke when people say, oh, it's really hard to find a needle in a haystack. That should actually be pretty easy, because a needle and a haystack are very different.
Very different.
But analytical chemists, it's about finding a needle, particular needle, in a stack of needles.
Yep.
And so while we don't often build, or we don't do a lot of synthesis, we may build molecules or engineer instruments that will then be used as detective tools.
Right.
And so I think that analysis, and then also being able to look at the data and treat it in a certain way, whether it's statistically or modeling the data, to then kind of stand back and look at it. What the hell does it mean?
Right.
And really, it is sometimes that way where you just you project it and you have this thing, and then you have to step back and look at it. And it might be one of those things where I know for sure this has happened to me, where you're looking at the data, it means something, and you bolt upright at 2 a.m. and it has come to you. Where you have seen this pattern before, what the pattern indicates. And then you run to write it down.
Well, this is fascinating, because I think that, people who are not chemists or scientists for a living might have a different idea of what it means to do chemistry. The process you're describing, it sounds much more creative and artistic than a lot of people might think. But so when you say the pattern, you recognize the pattern. A pattern in what? What are you looking at?
So, there's sometimes, so I build sensing devices, and sometimes they're chemical sensors. So one chemical will interact with another and give off some signal. And a lot of times it's a color. It changes color, or it fluoresces. There might be bioluminescence or some kind of luminescent event. And so you might do something like trying to you might have several of those sensors. And then not just do you look at how does it change, You're looking how if one change is in relationship to another.
Right.
Is there some type of pattern in how certain sensors behave? And then what does that tell you about what they're interacting with? Because oftentimes you're trying to design something to find, at least for me being forensic, I'm trying to find, quote, bad stuff.
Yeah.
Weapons, chemical, biological, explosives, scheduled stuff. So how then does the sensor respond? Because it's not enough to build it and have it be reliable and be like, yep, it always does. It always turns red when it's in whatever. You also, why does it do that?
Right.
Why does it turn red here but green here? And so sometimes you look at the data and you can use various tools, and sometimes you use chemometrics, which is like fancy chemistry statistics. And there's a way to, again, you're looking at changes of changes sometimes, and you map the data. And sometimes you'll look at a plot. And I think even economic data, there's lots of people that have all kinds of data. And you might plot it in a lot of different ways. Bar chart, pie chart, Venn diagram. Like you're just plotting it. And then you know that there's something there. And you just, sometimes you just don't recognize the pattern or how one thing influences another. And you just need to step back from it for a moment. And literally, it could be literally. I have literally projected things and literally just stepped and just gazed on it.
Yeah.
And I do feel like maybe that is a bit of the creative thing where sometimes I've gone to museums and pieces of art and you're not sure that you're seeing what either, quote, you should, or what maybe either the artist thought, or maybe you're seeing something that is not intended, but you need to get a better look at it. And sometimes you step forward, but sometimes, like, there's been a few pieces I remember when first time I went to the Uffizi Gallery and saw, say like the Allegory of Spring or the Birth of Venus. I had no idea they were that large.
Because you see photographs.
Because you see little small,
yeah.
Or some things, or like the Mona Lisa's that small.
Mona Lisa's, I was
right?
going to say
and
that.
You just have to step, sometimes with the ones that you're like, that thing is the entire side of the room.
Right.
And you are almost out in the hallway trying to really see the full picture of all the data and what it means in relationship to other data. And that's what oftentimes we do in science, is that, because you might have a very simple data set. Okay, this thing turns red. But then the more sensors you add, then you have 17 of those things. And then you're trying to detect 100 different chemicals. So all of a sudden you have a very complicated pattern.
Yep.
And you need to kind of step back and say, well, what does it all mean in relationship to each other? And so that part, there is a creative aspect in how you visualize it. And I think sometimes I look at, why did that person paint that way? With that shadow, or why is that so abstract, or why did they sculpt it in that way and this, and then maybe it's, maybe we'll never know. I do think that sometimes artists take stuff literally to their grave and they don't communicate the intention or anything. And sometimes, the point is you take from it what you find important. But you do sometimes from every angle have to step kind of back and see, okay, can I interpret it in different ways? And I feel the same thing with scientific data.
Absolutely, right. Yeah.
Different treatments. And it's not as if you're making it up, but you are doing different, like, again, I'm going to make it a bar chart versus a line graph. And then what does that visualization reveal about the underlying process?
And the thing about chemistry and crime fighting or whatever is that there's so many different ways that the chemicals are involved in the investigation, right? So let's say you are called out. Like, you still get called out even though that you're a professor now, not a crime lab technician? Do you visit crime scenes?
No.
You're very sad about this?
I'm, in a way I'm not, because it's a very stressful job, and academia is stressful in different ways. But also, there's the cost benefit. I get to do other things now.
Yeah, okay. All right, let's pretend that that's not true. Let's pretend you get called out all the time.
Okay.
What is on your mind when you're called out to a crime scene? What are you going to be looking for as a chemist? What good is the chemist out there at the murder investigation scene?
Well, I think it obviously depends on, what kind of background. So typically when you would get there, you would get briefed by who's ever in charge of the scene, which, is not you.
They remind you of that?
And so, no, but like when you watch on the TV, you're like, what are the police for? Because the CSI people are always running around. But like, the background is important. of, what should we be looking for? What shouldn't we be looking for? What's missing is just as important as what maybe should be there. And so
what does that mean? What's missing?
Well, let's say that you had somebody that had a severe shellfish allergy, and you hear that from family, but yet you're not seeing anything. You don't see an EpiPen.
Right. None of the drugs they might have.
You don't even see a medical alert bracelet, which is really odd.
The dog that didn't bark. Yeah.
You just also what's not there. Or if the person was, you hear from the ME that someone was shot or somebody was stabbed or they were strangled, but there's literally no weapon around. So what's not there can be just as important as what is there. And so, and the same thing goes with any kind of analytical data. And I'm sure in physics and astronomy, at least from, friends that I have in those fields, it's not only looking for what's present, but what is not there can tell you a lot too.
So if someone is poisoned or something like that, I could absolutely understand the usefulness of a chemist. If someone's shot or knifed, is there still things for the chemist to do at the crime scene?
There might be, and chemical tests, though, in which whether it would be a chemist there or not, but sometimes, you might do like gunshot residue. Okay. And so presumptive tests for that, or they would actually collect, swab hands, very similar to what you get screened for testing at the airport. They might swab your hands, and then they might actually take that swab and secure it and transport it, and then you maybe do some X-ray spectroscopy and or some type of atomic emission or absorption spectroscopy to see, okay, are the metal components that you would typically find in gunshot residue, are they present, and maybe at what amount? So that would be some level of analytical chemistry. But also, let's say that there is, you're trying to say, okay, is this red-brown stain? Is it blood or not?
Right. Okay.
Then you would do some type of chemical presumptive test, or even, okay, so it is blood, but is it human? Then you might do an immunoassay that would illuminate that.
So what does that mean exactly? How do you figure out whether blood is human or not?
Certain antibodies for different types of animals would be present or not present. And you can do kind of like the same type of technology as a pregnancy test.
Okay.
To kind of do, it's really a dipstick. It does look a lot, it reminds you a lot of a pregnancy test. And you can kind of get an idea and say, oh, it's, which doesn't, that might lead you to another thing of why is there dog blood here then?
Right. Like, there's no dog.
Right.
Dead,
like, what's that?
Dog blood everywhere.
Or so that, I think that's another thing, is that there are lots of tests that folks do. And so, a lot of even the presumptive, and by presumptive test, I mean that it's just a quick screening test. Usually they change color, really visual, really fast to do. And so sometimes there's real popular ones for scheduled drugs that will, if you roadside, they're very popular, like highway patrol, or if you're screening something, and then you put a little sample in a little baggie, break a couple of ampules, and boom, purple. Okay. Right. And
so
then,
that's not even a professional chemist. That's like the cop on the street can do a little amateur chemistry.
And a lot of those have been developed.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's a lot of development behind that to get it down to it being that, quote, simple to do.
Right. Yeah.
And so those types of tests are very popular, and then they're just providing quick information to maybe make some type of a command decision. And so that's chemistry, chemical development of fingerprints. So say on paper, you can use an anhydrine, which interacts with amino acids, turns purplish pink color, works like a charm on porous materials. So
you can get fingerprints off of paper that way.
Yeah, visualize. So it'll stay on the material.
Yeah.
But you can visualize, this print matter, and that actually came about when folks were trying to do staining and chromatography of proteins and amino acids, and then they were like, hey, this might be useful for this other thing.
Solve murders with this, yes.
And there's many things like, even cyanoacrylate or superglue fuming that you see a lot on the TV. That was a total, oops. I mean, we say that, but that's, it's a very useful kind of technique. And so that's a very, interesting chemical process that people are still talking about in literature about how exactly it works. What's the mechanism?
Oh, so we know it works, but the chemistry, the sort of individual chemistry is not completely understood?
We think we're pretty good.
Pretty good, okay.
But I feel like that's a lot of, we have really good mechanisms worked out, or we think we've got, very strong evidence that this is this the action?
Right.
Until we don't.
Yep.
Until
a better idea comes along.
There's lots of, and the fun, when I think about, say, slime, which might seem unrelated, the kids and adults, let's face it, love making with the glue and the borax, love making slime. And just this year in chemical and engineering news, people, it was, still in literature, in real chemists are still debating about how that actually works. And everyone thought that was a for sure lock. And you realize that, no, it's not actually that, it's actually this instead.
I think that you're more familiar with this process of slime making than I am. How do you make slime?
Okay, so
I don't make slime intentionally.
Well, any of your listeners that probably have kids have made it, or so that's the you just basically like Elmer's glue, and you add in a little borax, like a soap, borax soap, the powdered soap, old school. I don't know if maybe in college in the labs they had the borax soap. And then you basically mix it together, and it becomes this non-Newtonian fluid. You would love this. Like
I would. I'm going to go home and get some Elmer's glue.
It's super, and it's super fun. And of course, you can make it with different types of polymers: clear glue, white glue. People put glitter in it, food coloring, and like bespoke slime. But part of it too is, even though that process was like, we know how it works. It's a polymer. It cross polymerizes. Blah blah blah. We're out the door. Then in the last couple of years, people were like, actually, it's not this discrete repeating, cross-polymerization we thought it was. It actually is. And so I find that really fun, because even though the best evidence at the time, people were very confident, it's explained a lot, but then you get better techniques too, right? And we've seen that definitely in forensic science, where the trajectory of the field has changed. The instruments get better. You're able to see, literally see either smaller amounts or levels of detail that change. Even small amounts can revolutionize an entire thought process.
Would you say that chemical forensics is becoming more important over time in crime investigation, or less?
I definitely think more. I think that, the use of science in both criminal and civil matters has really dramatically increased in the last, I would definitely say in the last 200 years, and definitely in the last 30. And I think it's kind of funny, because one of my shows I grew up with, Murder, She Wrote, kind of demonstrates that over, that show was on I think for 12 years, but when it was on, you straddled the era of pre-DNA and post. And you see that in the show, the things that they talk about in early episodes, and you can get fingerprints and like ABO typing, and you're just like,
why would anyone do that?
Right.
Yeah.
And then later, it's a big
DNA,
big revolution. And then even watching shows, Columbo, where they they'll have a handgun, they'll take a handkerchief from their pocket and think that they're somehow protecting the prints, or they'll take a pen and literally either the pen and stick it down the barrel of the gun to pick it up.
Even I know that's a bad idea,
right? Like all
destroying all the rifling. Yeah.
But I think even that visualization, you can see how even the perception, and how shows are run now. And now it's not uncommon to see whole shows where they show folks in Tyveks, and they're changing out their booties, and they've got gloves that they keep changing every, so you've seen the evolution of a field be mirrored in, television and movies, and sometimes and sometimes there's artistic license taken. But definitely the field is that reflects the big changes in the field, which continue. I mean, they march with the technology.
And do the chemists get very involved with poisoning and things like that, or is that mostly medical people?
So medical examiner really depends on the state. I mean, there's the difference between if you're doing testing of, say, tissues and biological fluids, that's typically under the control of the medical examiner. And then that person would send tests out or request samples be processed by toxicology folks, and maybe histology and pathology. They're looking at different, depending on which, like if is it tissue or is it, say, urine, or is it that kind of thing. So different types of materials and different types of tests. But if you say, you found some mysterious white powder, that actually might go to trace.
I see, right. So once it's in their body, then maybe it's the medical examiner's job.
That's a different deal.
But when you find all sorts of chemicals around, then the chemists get involved.
Yeah,
sure.
And there was a big workplace poisoning case in Germany this year where a worker, allegedly, is, dozens of their coworkers. And the last one that kind of kicked off them finding that, first of all, nobody had known this workplace poisoning was going on, that spanned maybe, he'd worked in that company for 40 years.
He's just killing people, poisoning
potentially
people?
Because, this one worker brought their lunch, in the break room, you're putting it in the fridge, your biggest concern is you hope Susan doesn't eat your wontons, right?
Exactly.
And so they open up their thing and they see this white powder that they didn't. Why is it on their sandwich, right?
Right, yeah.
And so, they, told their supervisor, who, at first was like, oh, it's some kind of a prank or whatever. And of course, me being a chemist, I'm like, that's not a prank. That's not a prank.
Mysterious white powders. Let's assume the worst.
And so, they do some testing. And in the meantime, they also installed CCTV. And it seems as if they did not maybe inform people that they had installed cameras. And so it turns out they got this person on video opening lunches.
Just for kicks.
And I think that's the thing that, the investigation is going to look into, of what was going on there.
Yeah.
And, they do testing and they realized, it was lead acetate, which is very sweet tasting, but incredibly dangerous. And, but then they go back and they realize, he had so many different types of poisons too, that could have potentially mimicked, especially these would be like a chronic poisoning, not an acute. So it might look like coworkers were ill. And at the time the person was arrested, there was one coworker in a coma and one on dialysis.
So this poisoner was an aficionado. Like he didn't have just a bucket of bad stuff, but he had a retinue of different possible
There's
ways.
A lot there to unpack, right? And then they start going back and looking at that, how many coworkers of this person had died in the last 20 years. And there's there's going to be a lot of work to do.
Wow. All right, so chemists are going to be fully employed by this job.
I think toxicology and then medical, there's tons of stuff. But I also think, my chemistry background too, working in analytical, I did image analysis and video, which seems a bit odd. But then how photography works, how digital data works, and how things are stored. An image is, in some ways, an image is an image. So if you have, a camera that's hooked up to a microscope versus a security camera, how do those work? What does the data mean? How do you retrieve the data? And so I think just like in a lot of other fields where, you can translate the skills you've learned to this maybe new application or looked a bit tangent.
Yeah.
You can do the same thing, definitely.
And it's not just, figuring out how a murder was done or who did it. There's presumably a lot of chemistry involved in things like finding the body or, analyzing old cases and old... one thing I do want to say is that I don't, it was never my job to solve anything. That's definitely a big thing. It's like, that's the police's job, right? But you might say, okay, is this possible? And the thing would be like, or provide some data. But I think I think some of the most interesting stuff that comes out is trying to find like clandestine graves. And how do you find when people have been moved or if people had been there? Right.
And so trying to develop, chemical tests. And, of course, geologists do this as far as, types of imaging and trying to look at, and even, different life scientists of how different plant growths, and then entomologists, what kind of bugs are there. Like trying to locate those things. and trying to map those, you would think, I mean, even I sometimes am like, is that a big problem that we have a lot of clandestine graves? And it turns out, yes.
Yeah, really?
Or trying to
so
find
a clandestine grave, this is not supposed to be a grave.
Not supposed to be a grave, but yeah.
So it's like a dead body in your yard and you didn't.
Yeah. And actually in LA, so we're in LA now, and there's just a case that happened where someone discovered a decaying skull in their backyard and then packed it up and brought it to a police station. And the police at first, this was just reported by LA Times, I think it was yesterday, and the police were like, that we thought it was a prank at first, because
Halloween,
and, my thing is like, so if you find that, don't move it.
Don't move it, right.
And, the police will come to your house and take care.
It's possible you don't want the police to come to your house.
Right. And so I think that's the thing is, sometimes there's those types of endeavors, or when you have missing people, or and it could be historical. I think there's also, kind of historical forensics where you might be trying to investigate a certain event and trying to really get, so now that, again, technology advances and maybe we can start, finding certain mass graves, or when, certain sites that, things that people thought would occur. Or sometimes there was a case that I wrote about for my column that was like Renaissance era poisoning, potentially. That was the rumor.
That's a long time ago.
Oh yeah. And the rumor was, this was the Medici's court in Florence, which was just a hotbed of scandal and activity and art and intrigue and all this stuff. And there was this rumor that this, these folks, philosophers and poets, had been poisoned, and in an odd way or a good way. I feel weird saying that, but there are certain poisons that just, they stay with you. They're literally in the bone.
Okay.
Or in, certain amounts that get preserved. And so it was really interesting work that they did, because they had baseline, say, arsenic levels that just take it again, because that's everywhere. That's a naturally occurring element.
Yeah.
And it can be in drinking water, it can just be around. So there's that really small baseline quantity. And so they had that kind of environmental background of what was kind of just present at the time.
Because arsenic is not some complicated molecule. It's an element. Yeah. One atom.
And so, they have that baseline. And you can get that in a lot of ways. We have a lot of artifacts from that period. I mean, the stuff is just literally everywhere. But then, they did some interesting work where they found that for one of the two courtiers, the amounts that they then found were like way beyond what they found in kind of separate remains that would have just been more like, this is pretty standard. And it's, again, maybe then the leap of saying this was a malicious poisoning, that's a legal law enforcement thing. But when you look at the levels and you go, wow.
And they were in the Medici
is now, does that mean that it's a criminal? Again, we're also talking about an era where you could, and even much after that, you could go to a pharmacy / chemist and pick up stuff that nowadays you're like, I'm sorry, you could do what? You could just go to the pharmacist and pick up. The
rules were looser back then.
Strychnine and cyanide and so it's hard to say, but the levels are interesting to be like, so that's, someone needs to explain. I mean, it's more about, what's the reasonable explanation that's not just casual, like.
Well, we tell stories about the Medicis and, it's kind of fun, palace intrigue stuff, but are we exaggerating, or was there really that much poisoning going on?
I feel, it's when you look back on those things, people always say now that, like, oh, this, kids these days or nowadays. And I'm like, I mean, there was some stuff going on, right, between the Borgias and the Medicis and, the stories that you hear. But then, I mean, that become almost integrated into historical lore. And that's why, sometimes the folks that go back, and if you look at like the Egyptian houses in the Upper and Lower Egypt, that, what is that? With great power comes great responsibility. I think with great power also comes great shenanigans. And there's just a lot of, potentially things that have gone on. And part of it is, wow, really? Like I remember the first time I heard about the Borgias, I was like, oh, scandal. And again, we think that that's very modern.
Right.
Some of these things.
No, it goes back.
Oh yeah, and I think the kind of the nicknames that things get, like arsenic, like inheritance powder. That's how common it was. When you think
speed up your inheritance process a little bit.
When you think about those things, or hemlock and belladonna and strychnine, and you think about all these things and how easy they were to get,
right?
And how so and so's uncle or whatever had a gastro distress, and then took a long time. And this is also an Agatha Christie device of sometimes it is artistic, and sometimes art is just mirroring that, yes, so-and-so, aunt whatever, did have an 8-month-long illness and then died, and then so-and-so inherited the house, or, some small bequeath. But then a lot of times you look back at the old newspapers and you realize that is like the whole
suspicious.
The Law and Order. I always loved the tradition, the old school Law and Order, where it says, or even in SVU now, it says that little proviso of, this is not. I mean, it may be similar, but
right.
This is ripped from the headlines, not actually. And you realize we've been doing that for a long time.
Yeah.
And some of these cases, you're like, that hits a little too close to home, right?
Well, this is good. Let's switch gears from being the investigators to being the perpetrators. Let's put ourselves in the mindsets of the perpetrators. So we can maybe working our way historically works here. Like if you were back in ancient times, what were the good ways to off your nemesis?
Besides just like bludgeoning.
Yeah, I mean, let's say a little more subtle. Maybe you didn't want to be caught.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, that's the great thing about poison, right? Is at least presumably back in 2,000 years ago, if you bludgeon someone, it's pretty noticeable. But maybe you could poison someone and no one would know.
And I think that's the when you have some of the classic quote old school poisonings, they've been around for a long time. Your hemlock, your belladonna.
So what you want, I mean, presumably the trick is you want something that the person imbibing it wouldn't know about. Not too strong a taste. But of course, how do you know it doesn't have too strong a taste? You don't want to taste it.
Well, I mean, that's where the, kind of folklore and legend, and people, I mean, that's the other really interesting thing is when it comes to poisons, the certain things, again, that people think are kind of, quote, modern inventions, poisons, abortifactates, birth control attempts, this has all been well documented in texts. I mean, as soon as people could be writing down things, they were either writing down, how to kill, how to not get pregnant, how to terminate a pregnancy, or, oh, wait, we need to write down some laws,
Yeah.
These types of, and bills of sale, I think the historical folks would be like, no, bills of sale came first, like those kind of tracking things. But all of that, when you look back at some of these, some of our earliest great, scientific texts, and again, at the time, it was the best they could do, because you read some of the things now and you're like, that would never have worked. But, there was a lot of information. And sometimes, again, it was observed that so-and-so ate this plant that was grown by the river. And
yeah.
And so, unfortunately, and so that's why, like, that kind of information. But poisons, certain types of poisons have been known for a very long time. And people have been killing each other with poisons in one way or another, whether literally chemical or biological, also, and being intentional and trying to infect people. People were flinging rotting corpses over walls and, leaving dead rats in water wells and trying to do different things, and also just kind of bulk poisoning for a long time.
And one of the things you hear about is carrying poison not just through ingestion, but through a garment or a weapon or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
How plausible are those?
Pretty
devices?
plausible. I mean, we've got, most folks know about like curare and darts and arrows and things like that.
Yeah.
And also, lots of Greek mythology and ancient plays, we'll talk about like a poison dress. The poison dress trope is really popular, of, kind of saturating fabric and having it somehow, and also like a metaphor of having it be beautiful and then having it kill you. And that you covenant.
The person who wore the dress would be the victim of this.
Yeah. And sometimes, or any garment could be a dress, could be, a fancy garment, could be, kind of reminds me, when even the crown. So even, Game of Thrones, bit, and it wasn't really a poison, it was hot molten gold, but like you lust for something and you covet it so much.
There's
a symbolic element
aspect
there. But when you read some of these plays like Medea, and you go, oh, so that again didn't come from nowhere.
And what happened in Medea?
So again, the poison dress trope, where it kind of actually reads a bit like a napalm. And then when you think about open flames and how, and even flammable fabrics have always historically been a problem for ladies as far as the types of materials dresses are made out of, and the fact that there was so much fabric for certain folks, and that, lighting devices were literally open flames.
Right. Yeah, everything was open flame.
So, this kind of danger of that, and the visualization of that whole thing.
It looks good when your dress catches on fire.
But even in a more artistic way, to make a statement like Hunger Game, right? That whole visualization. But when you think about, there's lots of routes of exposure. There's ingestion, there's gas, there's like through the skin. And so there's a lot of methods, and that also, is interesting, and historically it goes way back. Could have been something that you were touched, could have, again, like clothes, and you saw that the danger too, like World War I, which is called the Chemist War. Some of the...
It's not really called that by anyone who's not a chemist.
Right. Unless you're a historian, maybe you call it the Chemist War. But also some of the challenges with some of the earliest nerve agents and today is that they persist in the environment and on your clothes. Well, if you're in a theater of war, you can't really start running around taking all your clothes off. I mean, even in a lab environment like Lab Safe, anyone who's been through lab training knows that, if you spill something on yourself, you got to go use, shower. But the first, you're actually supposed to take off this garment because it's keeping it against yourself. And so that's definitely based in history or fact with some flair. And the ancient Greeks really did love their flair when it came to their tragedies.
They invented drama and tragedy, right? Yeah.
So that's definitely rooted in...
Do you think that it was an impetus for early chemistry, the desire to kill people in more creative and interesting ways?
I think finding out, it's fun. It's funny because, when you think about maybe the history of chemistry, but in specific analytical chemistry, was to test currency. You're talking about time where currency or things that you could trade, you had to prove they were the chemical composition they were. Is it gold? Is it silver? And for a long time, salt was considered a currency. And you could trade and barter because it was so damn expensive. I mean, we don't think of it nowadays because it's like laughably cheap. Right. You can buy like a bucket of it for like $1. But is it what it actually is? This thing that you've attached huge value to. And that's one big thing. And then, of course, the other one is we got to find out why these people keep dying. And so I feel
that's an important question.
I feel like, in analytical, there's definitely this kind of, you're trying to, again, solve mysteries of either, is this thing what we say it is? Because either it's going to be the foundation of an entire economy, which can cause the entire thing to collapse if the gold isn't gold.
Right.
Or we have such a problem with proving goods are what they are, which again is a foundation of economy. Or, again, like the poisoning thing, and Deborah Bloom did a great job in her book, Poisoner's Handbook, of tracking why that was such a thing. Because, again, in a foundation of a society, I mean, the poisonings were not that common that it was literally, but it's the confidence and it's the security of society, which is very tenuous.
Yeah.
And doesn't take a lot of criminal behavior.
No, I had to
do that.
A great podcast with Neha Narula talking about digital money. And, first you have to agree that it's money, right? And digital currencies are struggling with that right now.
So the perception of safety and security, whether it's in the economy or your person, that a lot of the earliest chemical tests were based solely on that, on a level of protection and community and security of, what does that mean? Because we've had to all agree and trust.
Right.
And yet trust can be violated.
Yeah. And so once we get to the Renaissance, if you're Lucretia Borgia and you have an annoying cousin, what do you do? Like, how do I go shopping for poison?
Ooh, yeah.
Or do I need to make it myself?
Well, or you'd have your right hand person, but also your apothecaries and your thing. And I think there's always been a challenge of, what is that old proverb? The only way three people can keep a secret is if two of them are dead. The more co-conspirators that you have. And so, sure, if you can do it yourself and keep your own counsel, but I think that's actually a biblical phrase, keep your own counsel, then that would be, better in that. And
right.
So, some of these folks were actually quite good, but also the important thing to remember is at the same time that these things are lethal and poisonous, a lot of the same things were in cosmetics. In smaller quantities, they were considered medicinal. It would not be uncommon, especially in an affluent household. When we think of I'm going to open my medicine cabinet and I've got acetaminophen and aspirin and antacids and 9 types of Band-Aids of various sizes, and I've got ointments. You have this whole spread, especially in a big household.
Right.
Well, that was, again,
so the equivalent of that.
Equivalent of that would have been, it would not have been uncommon to have some of these things. And then also think about pest control, which was also, kind of a big deal. Right. And also that, the beginning of understanding the pest's role in disease and all of that. But it wasn't also uncommon to get rid of vermin just because they ate your food. And even if the disease link came later, you knew they were eating your food, they were eating through your clothes, they were just pests. And so how do you get rid of them?
Okay.
So it was totally not uncommon for people to have buckets of the craziest stuff in their house, or to also be using it in some much smaller quantity in a medicinal way, again, whether it worked or not.
This sounds like a very 1800s kind of thing to me. Was that the high point for ingesting crazy substances as potential miracle cures?
Can go much earlier.
Really?
And and it's kind of fun to go to museums and you'll see these chests of things, and you realize that, especially again, the more affluent the house, or whatever the equivalent would be of, middle class and up, and even more precarious socioeconomic positions, there were, kind of the community medicinal chest,
right?
Or things people had access to.
So, what kinds of things?
So, you just had to say, different herbs, and some of the things that we would think now are basil, right? Or flavoring agents, or things like that. Or peppermint, different mints that were soothing on the stomach, or let me do a combination of, a little bit of mint with pennyroyal and add in, these kind of concoctions that you'd inherited from, grandma, whoever, and it just seemed to work. And again, the fun thing is, from a natural products thing, there's a lot of things that you carried forward and you're like, that actually did work, and so we're going to now make it and manufacture it, and it's aspirin, right? So some of these things, and people go back to, there's a whole, area of scholarship where people go back into historical tests and try to figure out what was this thing and then test it,
right,
against modern or historic diseases, and see that, hey, it really did. Even on a weird way, honey and mummification, the antibacterial properties in honey, it wasn't just it wasn't a weird thing or because it was sticky. It actually, it served.
Sorry, I didn't know that honey played a huge role in mummification. Is that true?
Yeah, a little bit. There's lots of different types of mummification protocols. But some protocols, actually a thin layer of honey. And it did help keep down some of the little bacteria friends from getting a bit out of control.
That's crazy to me, because it seems like it's sweet and nutritious, and it would attract all sorts of crazy things.
But it's jam-packed full. It's another chemical. It's just, the things like honey and coffee, we just don't think about of what they contain.
Okay.
And it's 1,000 chemicals. And it's got all kinds of stuff in there. It's an animal product, honey. You've got all kinds of cool stuff in there that could be serving some really interesting purpose.
Right.
What are the animals doing with it? Yeah. I'm not sure that they're making it so that I can have it on my toast, right? So there's some really interesting, and again, it's an active area of scholarship. Huh. And some of the plants that are, that people grow, it's ornamental, it might be poisonous, or it's ornamental, and it seems like, if I place it here, it keeps down these types of pests and insects. Well, it's, releasing this volatile organic chemical, and there's really something in that people have known about. And gardeners, it's not an accident that these very elaborate gardens that were planned out plants were where they were, and it wasn't just because they looked cool. When you talk to, or you read at these old historical documents, you realize, oh, that's why they're trying to keep down pests or trying to attract certain things, or, certain gardens place certain things there because if you weren't well, you would want your medicinal garden close to the house. You weren't going to have to
that makes sense.
hike out to.
Right.
And so some of that knowledge, now we have better tools so we can kind of find or dismiss, certain things. And I think that's kind of the fun part, is that you can look back and say, okay, well, that explains it. Or you're like, I have no idea why everyone was sprinkling arsenic in there. Why? Why were you people doing that?
Well, and nowadays we presumably know a lot more. Would we be able to commit the perfect crime with our chemistry knowledge now? Hypothetically, of course. We're not advocating anything here.
Whenever, and I've done some panels where, how to commit the perfect murder and things like that. And it's funny because I never think it comes with planning in that way, in the perfect murder weapon, because sometimes even chemicals like succinylcholine, which is a really scary agent, it's a medical purpose. It's if it's used, it's probably because you're going to be intubated, and it works on a certain type of muscle where it completely is going to paralyze it. Unfortunately, the type of muscles are also the ones that help you breathe. However, if you need intubation, they need to get that tube down your throat like that. There's that, and you're gonna. It's all very well coordinated.
Right.
But if you use it for nefarious purposes, it goes very, very bad. And for a long time, it was such an odd poison to use as a poison. Again, we have the ones that we've developed a lot of tests for, that we know what they look like. These are the symptoms. Our tests, we've got very simple tests. They're going to be the first run, like arsenic, say carbon monoxide, cherry, your skin turns like a cherry red. There's other types of drugs that would cause cyanosis, so your skin would turn blue. But something like succinylcholine is such a weird, it's a very specific application. It's not one of the heavy hitter poisons, the historical poisons, that it literally wasn't found. Now it's been, that jig is up.
Yeah.
Because it just was not commonly used.
So I guess that,
so you could at one time, that really went under the radar, and you could get away with some stuff because nobody was looking for it.
So if you're poisoning somebody, you might want a chemical that disappears from the body.
Rapid metabolism, which succinylcholine, that can be an issue. Another one would be some of your, say, your drug facilitated crime molecules.
Yeah.
Like scopolamine, which I wrote about recently, where again, not only is it an issue because the metabolism can be fast, but one of its effects is memory loss.
Oh, perfect.
And it affects so by the time you might even realize, or even if you do, that maybe I should seek medical attention 3 days later, and, whether a metabolite could be found or which metabolites, so the drug's action itself limits its ability to be found. And that's a big, but that's great. There's a whole area of scholarship, going with that one, and, really seeking out. So every new drug or new poison, requires another set of people like myself who develop a method. Like it's a race. It's a race against time. Somebody comes up with something and you've got to find a test for it.
So today's perfect murder is tomorrow's, easily solved crime, but you got to keep ahead of the curve.
Same thing with inheritance powder. Sure, it got that nickname, and for a lot of times people were able to get away with some really, outrageous stuff, and then you develop
a lot of these, even if they disappear from the body because they're metabolized, they have some other effect on, like you turn red, like you said. There
could be other effect, but even if they're metabolized, as long as we, the other important area of scholarship is really understanding that metabolism. Because even if you can't find the parent compound anymore, you can find all of its little metabolites in certain ratios. And then it's indirect, but it's very good evidence.
Right.
And there's tons of those. And so, again, so the application of building a technique does depend on that good old, not even old-fashioned, that clinical metabolism, really getting the mechanism and the why, so that you can build a better test. And it all, to me, it all comes together full circle of I'm an applied scientist, but the reason I can build better tests is I have to understand the basic research and the clinical applications and the roots in order to get to the point where the little test that everyone takes for granted that it's so simple
Comes back to the science.
It always comes back to that.
You wrote this wonderful little snippet in one of your columns that is relevant here. With its red color, bubbles, and sweetness, cherry Lambrini is a popular tipple. It is also a good disguise for the sweet killer ethylene glycol.
Oh, one of my favorites. Ethylene glycol was another one that for a long time went under the radar. And antifreeze.
It's in antifreeze, or it is antifreeze?
It is antifreeze.
Oh, okay.
And so, of course,
Again, easily
obtained. I mean, you can buy literally gallons of it. Now, the reason why, too, it's not actually that weird green color.
They color it?
They color it because they're like, hey, don't drink this. It's antifreeze, right? Because it's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
And, of course, the danger like that is that it's very sweet, like lead acetate. It's a very sweet thing. And so how you disguise it if you're trying to poison someone, much like, say, a lot of also plant-based poisons are alkaloids, and they can taste very bitter. And so where do you hide it? Right. And so that's why, of course, even in cinema, you see a lot of these poisons in red wine.
Or elaborate cocktails, right?
Or elaborate,
Sweet and
Carpani,
bitter.
Or, some kind of thing where it's like you're going to...
Antifreeze Negroni.
You're going to... but, antifreeze would be so sweet that kind of cocktail. Right. There was a big case where it was hidden in like a Propel or like a Gatorade, because Gatorade can be sweet.
Well, would you want to hide it in something else that was sweet, or do you want to balance it? Maybe I'm thinking more of a mixologist rather than a killer.
Right, and I think that is your first mistake. No, but you want like.
Terrible murderer.
You want right? If you're expecting sweet.
Okay.
Like this husband and wife, my wedding toast.
This is a real case.
This is a real case, and my go-to wedding toast is "May your marriage never be described as perfect by Dateline," because then right? Until. But in this case, it's such a sweet beverage that adding, a little bit
of antifreeze
is going to disguise it. You wouldn't want to add something like strychnine,
right?
It's too weird. Somebody would drink it. First of all, there's the white powder. You'd really have to work to get it dissolved. But also that bitterness would seem odd, right? So if a friend was a Negroni drinker, I'm not going to put antifreeze in it,
right?
Because the minute it hits the palate,
so sweet,
it's off. They were like, well, who made this?
Yeah,
and they dump it, and and so part of it is you want to do like dissolves like, and of course you have the really dangerous ones that are colorless, odorless, tasteless, which of course is dangerous for the person and maybe just what the doctor ordered for the villain. So
there's a known list of those things. Colorless, odorless,
there's
tasteless,
actually a nice little review article about the about 7 common homicide poisonings.
Oh, okay.
And it's weird or it's not weird, but just like everything else, things are in vogue.
Yeah,
things
there's
are
fashion,
not in vogue.
Right?
And again, it also becomes of how easy it is to get.
Sure.
Again,
because you don't want to arouse suspicion.
That's part of it. Good old-fashioned gumshoe intelligence police work, right? Of just amassing information. And there was a really old case that involves strychnine, where a person went to, you could just go to a store and buy it, because again, for pests, getting rid of rats, and it's still utilized in these kind of poisoned wheat, sprinkle it around. And so the shop owner was like, yeah, you did come in and you did buy that and you bought it and that was almost 200 years ago. So, and then of course there was 150 years. Yeah, there was 150 years ago. And then there was a test, there was, again, these preliminary tests of looking at these things. Then there was that, and they discovered that. But again, the tests were done later, right? The tests are always, later than you just went, and you went to every place that sold it. You looked on the farm, and yep, she was here. last Wednesday. That's the good old fashioned kind of gumshoe stuff. And even, I think that's the thing, is that even when you have the tests, people are still going to want to, but where did they get it?
Yeah.
Right?
There's we live in a world where there's a lot of records that are left by everything we do.
Yeah.
Right. So it's becoming harder and harder to commit a good murder. But.
And I think, the records. So when people ask me about, committing the perfect crime and some really elaborate scheme, I think the better thing to do is that when people have.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah. We've gotten away with something, quote unquote. It's really a kind of sometimes a perfect storm of incompetence. Sometimes of just low response time. Certain things weren't collected that should have been. Maybe the investigative officers made mistakes, or there were accidents, or again there could have been some level of professional incompetence. The prosecuting attorney declines to. I mean, there's almost like a perfect storm of things that can occur, where you couldn't plan for that though, unless you literally did the investigation of it needs to be on the corner of Sepulveda and at this time of night between a shift change, and then how did you find out? The pulling your Google search records and that kind of stuff, and so it can be the more you plan, the plan reveals your malfeasance.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah, but some others, sometimes I get mail from prisoners who want me to give them a free copy of my book or something like that because they can't get it in prison. Yeah. And part of me wants to help them out, of course, because they're in prison and they want to improve themselves. But when you get mail from prisoners, it always includes their prisoner number, and you can go and look up what they did. And so far,
you get way more exciting mail than I do.
So far, the ones I've gotten, it's not mail fraud. There's really bad things that these people did. This one guy, it's pretty clear that he killed his grandmother, and they never found her body. She disappeared, and from staying with him and things like that. But he got in prison for a related thing, but they never found her body. I mean, how do you get rid of the body? That's the other thing. Once I've committed the perfect crime,
you got a lot of options. But there's also weaknesses. Body transport can be where you get caught. There's the key cases where moving people and or bodies is when you got pulled over for that broken tail light. And so there's those.
How often do taillights get broken anyway?
You'd be surprised, or speeding, or a parking fine, or
you're nervous,
something like that. And so, but then you move it, then you've upped the number of people that see you, and especially now with CCTV,
right?
And parking garages and just the street and stoplights. And one of the first things that folks will do is they'll pull cameras from as many locations as they can, and someone's going to have to sit through it all. So all of literally just the transport can be hard. And also I would advise, because this is actually a real case, don't Google best disposal sites in Los Angeles County.
Can't you go to the dark web and do this without leaving a track?
Just saying, maybe. But also, again, it's, are you going to bury it in your house? Are you going to transport it? That's it. That time leaves you open and vulnerable. There was a different case where someone bought disposal type things, and they paid cash, but they went to a store with cameras, and then for some reason they wanted to use their club card so they could get a discount. Again, you cannot make these things up. No. Human behavior.
There's a selection effect that these are the ones we've caught.
Right. But on the other hand, but I think there's chemical disposal methods, right? Acid or base. There's fire. So trying to obliterate it that way. There is, It
would seem very difficult to incinerate a body if you didn't have the right equipment.
Oh, no, you can do it. Okay. I think
Dry it out first?
I think time and where you're at and how hot you can get things. That might shorten the time.
So if you're in a cabin in the woods, this might be the way to go.
Maybe, but then, why is there a huge smoke thing coming from that person's guy? I mean, I think there's always, that what you can't plan for is someone that decided to do them and their friend hike past your remote cabin and see you carrying that thing rolled up in a carpet out to the bonfire. Right. So there, and even the cases where, and in recent years you've had, it used to be the cliche was no body, no crime. It was at one time harder to prosecute those things. But almost with the advent of as much data and how everything, is kind of logged, and you have to kind of access certain records, unless this person is totally ghosted everyone and then gone completely off the grid, which is really, really hard to do, they're dead. Right? And that's not and then you look at the person's behavior and how they would, kind of carry on their life. And if they're not accessing their bank card, they didn't do a major withdrawal, their credit cards aren't being used, their car is still there. I mean, all of these things, then it's reasonable to conclude something has occurred. And so with the ramp up of technology, and sometimes our concerns about privacy and things like that are legitimate, but at the same time it's like, maybe a couple hundred years ago, maybe even 50 or 60 years ago, people would have been like, no body, no crime. Way
easier to get away with.
But now it's like no digital signature means that Aunt Glenda, it's just so hard to do that. But the
saving grace is that the crime labs are backed up by months or years, right? Doesn't that make it easier?
I think that that's the other challenge, right? So, that's a practical administration problem. And we've seen that manifest itself, especially with sexual assault test kits and with statute of limitations, where you're talking warehouses full of kits. And there was a great bunch of work
with kits that have just not been analyzed
because, again, the backlog, the cost, combination of those factors. But when they've gotten the funds and actually gone through, and there was, I believe it was in Michigan, they did all of this work and analysis because they got this funding, and they were able to process all these, backlog kits. And they found a number of serial predators. And, when you look at the data, again, you come back to the data and you look at these numbers and you look at again, I'm not oversaying it when I'm saying warehouses full of stuff, that it's just, again, you get away with it, not because you didn't leave evidence behind, but because of, limitations in staff, instruments, budgets.
Right.
And it's shocking and somehow so ordinary to say that, but that absolutely influences, like every other type of analysis. It absolutely influences what you can do.
Sure. I always like to end on a more or less optimistic note, and that was not it.
Sorry. Oh.
So, as we wrap things up, I did want to say, I hope that most of your students go into lives of fighting crime rather than committing it. They seem prepared for either one, but presumably the ones who are best prepared would be good at either one. But is it an exciting frontier for chemistry now in catching bad guys in better and better ways?
I like to think of it maybe as keeping us safe. And there's, again, not just catching bad guys, but I think also the things that we think about are just, kind of workplace contaminants or environmental accidents or as, someone who lives in Austin, Texas, we just had this boil water notice.
What was that?
Boil water notice. There was
boil the water?
You had to boil all the water because the processing plants weren't able to function at the way they could. And when, again, like a storm or, again, a hurricane, it doesn't have to be malfeasant. And
right.
So when I think about my students and even the work I do, which would still be forensic, even if it's not, duplicitous, is that it's in the business of keeping us safe and being able to have confidence in the things that we take for granted, our food and our drink and our air. And I think that being able to have the skill set to keep, yourself safe or at least be able to look at the data and make good choices, I feel like you're empowering folks. And so that's kind of how I look at what I do rather than the opposite of
Good.
catching bad guys.
Most people don't want to kill people or even catch bad people. They just want to live their lives safely and happily, right?
And
this is
they
helping
want to
them.
drink their water and eat their kale smoothies and and their bacon. They want to feel, and so that's how I look at it is, even though the CSI and the forensic stuff is, sexy and people find it interesting, for the most part, what we do is this mundane stuff that you just want to be able to, your milk is going to be good, your water is safe to drink, and, you've got a safe train station to walk through with no contaminants. I mean, that's really, so in some small way, I think a lot of scientists, in general, I think a lot of scientists are, I just want to help people, whatever small way that is.
And we're thankful for it. Ray Burks, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.